The line between normal and dangerous isn't drawn in blood, it's drawn in the mind. Psychology is present in our everyday lives, and so are the people the public deems crazy. The term psychopath gets thrown around often, but it tends to have different meanings in different countries. Across Canada, the United States, and Sweden, the same type of person can face very different outcomes determined not just by what they did, but by how each country defines the term psychopath.
In this documentary, we will explore one of the most misunderstood personality disorders in the world. We'll do this through multiple killers and countries, and we'll ask the tough question: what do you do when the mind lacks remorse, but the law demands responsibility?
I'm Wyatt.
And I'm Van.
And this is The Making of a Psychopath. Let's first talk about the definition of psychopathy. Psychopathy is a personality disorder that shows patterns of antisocial, impulsive, and sometimes aggressive behavior. It often includes lack of empathy, guilt or remorse, manipulativeness or deceitfulness, poor behavioral control, disregard for social norms, and often violence, as well as an antisocial lifestyle.
It is often identified during childhood and early treatment, and therapy can affect the severity of the disorder. There are thought to be a few different reasons of the cause of psychopathy, such as genetics, the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala of the brain, and early childhood trauma.
Psychopathy can also be inherited through a high exposure of psychopathic-like traits. 1% or 80 million of the world's population meet the criteria of being a psychopath. But of this number, only 30% reveal traits. Let's now jump into America's laws for the disorder.
The U.S. uses the most popular law for the diagnosis of insanity, the McNaughton Rule. The McNaughton Rule is a historic legal test that courts use to decide a criminal defendant's mental state. It is one of several tests used for the insanity defense. The defendant is found mentally insane if their state of mind caused them to not know what they were doing when they committed said act, or if they knew what they were doing but did not know that it was wrong.
In 1972, America added a more modernized legal standard of insanity, introducing the Model Penal Code, which stated a defendant is legally insane if they lack substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law.
The plea for insanity can be used if a suspect is diagnosed with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or severe PTSD, but also if they demonstrate acts of the anti-personality disorder. However, the insanity defense is used in less than 1% of all U.S. felony cases, making it extremely rare. But let's talk about one of the most famous cases, Ed Gein.
Ed Gein is an American serial killer from Wisconsin. Born in 1906, Gein grew up on a farm with a supposedly physically abusive father, leading to him having a strong relationship with his mother. With strong parental control, forbidding him to have any friends, Gein became what people saw as a social outcast, where he was reportedly a very shy kid who made weird mannerisms. From 1940 to 1945, dread followed Gein, as his father, only brother, and mother all died in the span of 5 years. In the years following, not many people heard from Gein, but this would change in 1957, when Bernice Wooden was reported missing. The disappearance was traced back to Gein, and he was soon arrested. The sheriff's department of this town searched Gein's farm and found multiple body parts and other disturbing findings. After the search of his farm, the sheriff's department was able to tie him to 2 murders. Gein was brought in for questioning, where he admitted to digging up recently buried bodies that looked like his mother, while in a daze. Gein was placed on trial, and in January of 1958 pleaded legally insane, through the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Gein had met the criteria under the McNaughton Rule, allowing him to plead insanity legally, as he did not fully understand what he did was wrong and did not fully understand what he was doing while he was in his described dazes.
But we still had some questions, so we decided to ask the AP Psych teacher, Miss Morgan,
Is there any difference between how the United States and other countries constitute a psychopath?
There can be. There's a really interesting TED Talk about a British man who was incarcerated within a hospital for psychopathy. It's inside the mind of a psychopath. It's a really cool TED Talk, and it's easy to see how manipulative the person who was incarcerated can be. Within the United States, though, we don't necessarily have a diagnosis or a legal classification for psychopath. It's just kind of a colloquial way we describe people who exist on that far end of the spectrum, where they lack empathy, where they lack engagement in a meaningful, caring way with other people. Probably the closest approximation to a diagnosable disorder we have that's like most commonly linked is antisocial personality disorder. And that's really where you see this whole long-standing pattern. It is who you are, where you are very manipulative, you focus on yourself above all others, you lack empathetic engagement, but it's also associated oftentimes with high intelligence and high levels of charisma, because you understand the social situation, you just don't care.
Called what the government uses in the United States, at least?
It depends. A lot of times there's interviews with psychiatrists and clinical psychologists. And remember, a psychiatrist is going to be a medical professional, so they have an MD and they are working on the medical side of things. A clinical psychologist is going to focus more on psychological disorders, but they don't have the medical background. They have a psychology background. So they're both doctorate level degrees, but they're going to approach it differently. They're going to do a lot of extensive interviews. They're going to look over medical histories. They're going to do evaluations, and those types of evaluations can be very different. The diagnostic criteria for determining if there is a disorder present, though, in the United States is the DSM-5-TR, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychological Disorders, 5th edition with a text revision. So I think that's about 8 years old now since we've had the text revision. So they use the criteria within that to determine if there is a psychological disorder present. And then that's going to be part of the process of determining were they essentially legally insane at the time, because insanity is a legal concept, not a psychological concept.
Now let's talk about Canada. In Canada, the legal idea of insanity is called not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder. This comes from Section 16 of the Criminal Code. Basically, it means that if someone commits a crime who is suffering from a mental disorder, they may not be held fully responsible if they either didn't understand what they were doing or didn't realize that it was wrong.
Compared to the United States, which uses multiple tests like the McNaughton rule, Canada keeps things more straightforward with just one standard across the whole country. The key focus isn't just whether someone has a diagnosis, but it's if that mental disorder affected them in the moment. If someone is found like this, then they are sentenced to a high-security psychiatric hospital, very similar to those in the United States.
However, they are given limited freedom and may eventually be released, depending on the progress they make while in the hospital. The goal isn't to punish the individual, but to treat the mental illness and keep the person away from the public to ensure safety. A popular example of this is Peter Woodcock, whom we will now talk about. Peter Woodcock was born in Toronto in 1958 and had a very unstable childhood. He experienced neglect and didn't form normal emotional connections with others. As he grew up, his behavior became more concerning, showing aggression and a lack of empathy. And at just 15 years old, he was arrested in 1973, suspected of killing 3 children. The 3 very young children were found to have died in graphic deaths, and all had multiple ties to Woodcock. During his trial, mental health experts found that he had serious psychological issues that affected how he thought and controlled his actions. Because of this, the court decided that he met the criteria for NCRMD. Instead of being sent to prison, Woodcock was placed in a maximum security psychiatric hospital. He stayed in the mental health system for decades, where professionals continued to evaluate whether he was still a danger to others. Over time, he was given limited freedoms under supervision, which caused problems. In 1991, Woodcock was granted his first publicly escorted day pass, in which he murdered a fellow inmate. Despite this abuse of the Canadian government's supervision, this reflects how Canada's system focuses on ongoing assessment rather than fixed sentences. And even after that, we still had some questions. So we decided to ask Van's dad, Benjamin Otto, who has a history and background in psychology.
What reasons can a person be considered a psychopath?
So again, psychopathology is not a clinical term, but it's really referring to a personality disorder, namely antisocial personality disorder. And the traits of antisocial personality disorder are a lack of empathy, a lack of understanding of social norms, all of those being listed in the DSM.
And are mental disorders something that you're born with, or are they developed?
So this is the classic nature versus nurture debate. For nature, are you born with it? There are predispositions to having certain psychiatric disorders. And then nurture, there are definitely traumatic experiences that can lead to disorders. And there are brain injuries and diseases that can also lead to psychiatric disorders.
How does the exposure of people around you affect the development that leads to something like that?
Yeah. So that would fall under like traumatic experiences. And those definitely have an effect, especially severe, long-term traumatic experiences. There are a lot of interesting examples of people developing psychiatric disorders because of traumatic experiences. Some people who have undergone years and years of traumatic experiences do not develop psychiatric disorders. So that probably, again, that's the nature versus nurture, sort of where those two things meet. It's both. You can't really say it's one.
The last country we'll talk about is Sweden. Sweden is different from the United States and Canada, as they abolished the not guilty by reason of insanity law. In Sweden, if you are found with a mental illness at the scene of the crime, you will still be tried as normal and can be found guilty by a court of law.
It is only after conviction that the Swedish acknowledge the mental illnesses, often adjusting the sentence due to the severity of the illness. They are similar to Canada through the treatment instead of punishment, which allows a person with a serious mental illness to obtain care and help. A well-known case that reflects this system is Matthias Flink.
Flink grew up in the town of Falun, Sweden. Born in 1970, his childhood was similar to that of the other killers we mentioned. His parents divorced when he was just 9, leading him to developing deep mental scars towards women as his mother left. After enlisting in the army, he experienced severe mental breakdowns at the beginning of 1994. Later that year, in June, Flink carried out a mass shooting in the town of Falun, killing several people. At the time, he was experiencing severe psychological distress, including paranoia and disorganized thinking. During his trial, experts evaluated his mental state and concluded that he was suffering from a serious mental disorder when the crime occurred. Because of this, he was initially sentenced to forensic psychiatric care instead of prison. However, after further evaluations, the court later ruled that he could be held criminally responsible, and his sentence was changed to prison. This shift shows the Sweden system can be complex, mental health assessments can evolve, and legal responsibility can be reconsidered based on new findings. Flink eventually served many years in prison before being released. This case highlights how Sweden tries to balance mental health, accountability, and public safety, even when the answers aren't always clear-cut.
Felt these types of emotions, you have no clue how to get in touch with them. Most of the time I would be feeling things like, like joy, the happy ones, right? Never guilt, never even really sadness, never remorse, although sometimes I regretted things. So I was aware that I had kind of a dull, let's say, emotional palette, kind of more black and white than color.
With the differences in these countries becoming apparent, we allow ourselves to ask these questions. People in these cases come and go, further pushing the idea of this line between sane and insane.
But psychology doesn't disappear when the story ends. It stays with us, shaping how we judge, how we fear, and how we define what it means to be human. The word psychopath will keep being used, debated, and misunderstood, shifting depending on where you are and who gets to decide its meaning.
Across countries, across courtrooms, the same mind can be seen in completely different ways. Sometimes as illnesses, sometimes as evil, and sometimes something even in between. And in those differences, we're forced to confront something deeper than law. Because this was never just about labels, or even about crime. It's about a question that doesn't seem to have an easy answer. What do we do when someone understands the world, but doesn't feel the same way we do? And maybe more unsettling than anything else, how certain are we that the line between us and them is as clear as we think? Thank you.